Hello, everyone. So it's an absolute pleasure to introduce one of the loveliest people I've ever met, Dr. Jennifer Gray. She is a teacher and performing artist living in Nashville, Tennessee. We were colleagues at Oberá International School together. That's how we met. We used to work in the performing arts together. So over to you, Jennifer. Yeah.
Hello, and I'm really glad to be talking to you because I love what I do. And I thought maybe you might be interested in how I got to this point in time. I am, as Mr. Maradona said, a teaching artist and a performer, and I have been for most of my life. But I didn't start out to do that. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do when I was a kid. It didn't even occur to me. I grew up in this tiny little village outside of the city of Boston in Massachusetts. There was no theater. I'm a theater artist, not a musician. And there was no theater, so I didn't know what theater was. But my parents were very encouraging of, I love to write. And I love to bring in neighborhood children and stage circuses in the backyard. And it just, I like to perform. I guess that's what it is. I started out liking to write and perform. All through school, I never went to the theater. I didn't know what it was. But when I was in high school, I was part of a group that would meet on Sunday and do theater. And I think that was the start of it. So that when I finished my junior year in high school, which is my second to last year in high school, the director of this program said, there's a summer program at Northwestern University called National High School Institute. And you might be interested in attending it. It would be 3 or 4 weeks of just nothing but theater. But it would be kids from all over the country. Some would come to study theater, some would come to study music, some would come to study science, some would come to study writing. They'd come for all different reasons. And I think that was really it for me. I went. The performance that they were doing that summer was The Diary of Anne Frank. Oh. And I was Anne Frank. And that just made me feel really good, because what it said to me is, even though I'm from this tiny little nowhere town, that whatever I have inside me was good enough to get that part, to get that audition, to win that part. So when I came time to go to university, I knew that I wanted to do something with theater. I didn't think I wanted to act. I thought maybe I'd like to direct or I'd like to write. So I went, my very first year, I went to the University of Massachusetts, and I studied theater. And I knew something was wrong when, as a freshman, as a first-year student at university, I was directing, I was choreographing. Now, I was okay for my small town, but I knew I had to go someplace different in order to get more of a background, more of a challenge. So I transferred universities in my second year, and I went to Northwestern in Evanston, Illinois, just outside of Chicago. Right. And Northwestern is a school where a lot of theater, very successful theater people go, successful actors, successful news broadcasters, even comedians. I mean, there's a huge list of alumni from that university that have been very, very successful. And I went and got really interested in theater for children.
Oh, I see.
And not as a performer again, but as a director and a writer. And so that experience sort of channeled me into the realm of education. that
Working with the
theater
children,
for
yes.
children would probably have some tie-in with schools. Now, there's an area of drama that in the UK has been called child drama. We called it creative drama. And it's where you go into a classroom and you work with the children to create something from their own ideas. You give them a stimuli, an idea, you give them a sort of a time limit, and then they create according to the criteria they've been given. I liked this. I did my student teaching in creative dramatics in Evanston, Illinois, in the school system. And just as I was graduating, the educational theater program opened up at New York University. It was the very first year of it. And I thought, I could go and do a master's in educational theater. I think that's what I need. And my parents were willing to send me. And so for a year, I went to New York University and studied educational theater. And educational theater is theater that you do in a school or for school children, or even socially relevant drama, I would say, could be educational theater. So I got very interested in devising theater. And I applied for 2 jobs after that and realized I'm from Boston. I know you're probably not familiar with the geography of the United States, but I applied for 2 jobs. One was in Alaska. I'm not even sure it was a state at the time, but one was in Alaska. And one was in Little Rock, Arkansas. Now, the idea of going to either of these places, you might as well have been asking me to go to the moon, because they were so foreign to me. I'd only ever been on an airplane once, and that, well, I guess twice, and that was to go to Chicago so I could do National High School Institute, and then so I could go to university. So I accepted the job. I actually went down and auditioned for this job, interviewed for this job in Little Rock, Arkansas. And I will always remember the audition because it's the first time I ever stayed in a hotel by myself. And I came in the night before the audition. I stayed in the hotel. I must have turned the television on and forgot to turn it off and fallen asleep, because when I woke up at about 7 o'clock in the morning, there was chaos on television. I had no idea. I kept watching it. I was fascinated. I knew something horrible had to have happened, but I didn't know what it was. And I actually had to go to the audition and say, could you please tell me what happened yesterday? Why is there craziness all over the television? And it was when Robert Kennedy was shot.
Oh my.
Robert Kennedy was shot. So that's how I'll remember that. Now, my job, I did get the job in Little Rock, Arkansas. They wanted me for a number of reasons. They wanted me because I went to Northwestern, and the reputation of that school spoke for itself. But they also wanted me because I was from Boston. I was from the North. They had a little problem in the South, and it was called integration. Schools, at least schools in Arkansas, were still segregated. White kids went to one school and everybody else went to another school. And when they gave me this job, they gave me this caveat. Not only did they want me to set up a theater for children, but they wanted me to make sure that theater was integrated. And that's kind of a fascinating responsibility. And I took it really seriously. So that in order to start a theater program in a community where they've never had a children's theater, I went to every high school in the city. There were quite a few of them. I went to every high school and I spoke to English classes, and I told them what I was doing. I said, I am having auditions next week for a play called Toad of Toad Hall. And I said, and I want all kinds of kids, and I want lots of them. I said, you'll be playing animals, but some of you might be a toad or a badger or a ferret or a stoat, but I want you to come and audition. You don't have to bring any material with you for the audition. Just come and we'll tell you what to do. They all knew where the art center was. And they came, and I had a great turnout. And after that, I did an operetta. I did Pirates of Penzance. And Pirates of Penzance is a Gilbert and Sullivan operetta, which some of you may be familiar with. But there's a major general in there who has a lot of children. He can have 5 children or he can have 50 children, depending on how many people you want to put in that cast. And what was really interesting to them was that the major general had 35 children, ranging in age from 7 to 18. And some of them were white children, and some of them were children of color. And it was something that the audience was surprised about. The kids were surprised too, because it worked. It just really worked. Theater was such a fabulous mechanism for bringing people together. Well, I only spent 1 year in this job. I probably could be doing it still because it was the best job. I loved this job. But I met a Scotsman while I was there. Strangely enough, in my own living room, my roommate was having a party and there was this Scotsman. And I had just come from theater school at NYU, where people put on accents and tell you they're from wherever they want to tell you they're from. So when there was this man in my living room in Little Rock, Arkansas, I said, "Where are you from?" And he said, "I'm from Scotland." And I said, "Oh, come off it. Where are you really from?" Well, it turned out he was from Scotland. And I married him, not then and there, a couple of years later. And in between, I went to Scotland, and I visited the Department of Education and there of certification. And I said, what would I need to do to teach in Scotland? And they told me what I needed to do, and I sent them all my stuff. And they sent me a certification. So I let them know that I wasn't going to start the school year in September. I needed to start the school year in January, the following January. And I taught in Scotland for a year, and that was fabulous because the male children in my classroom, I called boys. Boys, that's what I'd say, boys. They thought this was the funniest thing they'd ever heard, because in Scotland, you call the boys lads.
Yes.
So I'd go, "Now boys," and they'd imitate me. They'd go, "Now boys." It was pretty funny. But anyway, this is a long way of sort of telling you that I channeled myself into the niche of doing theater for young people. Maybe not little children, but young people. I was in that job for 1 year because after that, my husband and I went to Tanzania, where he had a consulting job. And after a few months, I got really bored. And so I went to the university and I said, "Do you need a teacher?" And they said, "Yes, we need a whole theater department." And I said, "Great." And they gave me 3 or 4 different classes to teach. And I began teaching theater to other students, university students who were interested in creating theater for adult audiences, theater for child audiences. Most of them were people who wanted to create theater with adults. And I did that for a few years, and that was brilliant. A funny anecdote about that experience was, even though the teaching language at the university was English, the teaching language in the elementary schools where we would perform was Swahili. And I didn't know Swahili, and I was not about to be able to learn it quick enough to be able to teach Swahili using Swahili. So I would script the plays that my acting students would do, and we'd rehearse it in English, and then they'd go into the school and perform it in Swahili.
Oh my.
So I would time it so that each piece that we did was maybe 10, 15 minutes, and we do 3 pieces altogether. So the whole performance could be up to 45 minutes. Well, when they started improvising this in Swahili, one piece could be an hour. They just got so into it. And the problem with my not understanding Swahili is I couldn't tell them where things went wrong or where things went right. You know, I just didn't know. I knew that the audience enjoyed it. So that was an interesting thing. So after that, I spent 3 years in East Africa, in Tanzania. And then I came to Nashville, Tennessee, just to visit some friends for a weekend. And that was 50 years ago. So I noticed when I came to Nashville that there seemed to be one theater for children in the entire state of Tennessee. And it was in Nashville. And I thought, well, what about all these other little communities? How do they get theater? And then I thought, I'm going to start a theater program. I'm going to start a theater program, a very small group of adults that have no scenery. We just carry a basket, and in the basket we'll put some hats and some fans and bits and pieces. And it was called the Imaginers Theater Company. And I did that for almost 20 years. And very early on, the Arts Commission, the Tennessee Arts Commission adopted us. And so they would provide the money for the schools to bring us in. So now that company had musicians in it, because the idea of the Imaginers is that I would come out as a storyteller and I would begin to tell a story, and then 4 actors would act out the story. We would rehearse it, it wasn't improvised. And there was a keyboard player who played because we didn't have scenery or lights or anything, he'd create the mood. Or if someone fell, or, you know, he'd make up a bang. Or if they were climbing up a ladder, they would mime climbing the ladder and he'd make the sounds. So he both played music and sound effects. And that was kind of an interesting, I loved that. I absolutely loved that. And it was so new to Tennessee that it was so new to Tennessee that that we used to perform not only for kids but for teachers. Now, when I started this theater company, I thought we'd perform for little children. I thought we'd perform from maybe ages 5, 6, 7, maybe up to 8. Well, early on, we performed at a school superintendent meeting. And this was superintendents of schools from all over Tennessee, and they wanted us to perform for their high school students. And I thought, but my material is for little children. And you know what? We did the same material for 5-year-olds that we did for 12-year-olds, because what I wrote was funny. It was folk tales, fairy tales, fables, poetry. It was other people's stories that I would script, but I'd script them to amuse myself. And so if you perform for children, they'd kind of take it at face value, but their parents would think it was hilarious. So like we had Goldilocks and the 3 Bears, and Goldilocks had chains, and she was just kind of a real hipster and very mouthy. So so it works because interesting stories are interesting stories, whether the kids are 5 or the kids are 50. They're just interesting stories. And I did that for about 20 years. And then I took a little break from theater and went to work for the man who had been major professor when I did my doctoral work at Vanderbilt University here in Nashville. It took me a long time to do it. It took me 10 years to do it. But I did it. And the minute I graduated, he knew me, and he was starting a company which turned out to be the very first socks store specialty company in the world. I know they had them early on in England. I know they did, but this was in the 70s, and they knew nothing about business. When I say they were two PhDs, and I had to create characters for them. The characters I created were called the sock doctors. And I had to create characters so that they could get interviewed on television and radio and just create interest in their company, and people would come to their store. So starting out in 1981, they had one store outside of Nashville, Tennessee. 10 years later, they had 92 stores. So it was it just grew, it was popular, it was terribly successful. And that was me with a theater background. What they did is they didn't know what to call me, so they wanted me to be their director of fun. So not only did I create personas for them to be, but picture this. The sock doctors wore purple curly wigs. They wore Argyle socks that were different on each foot. One of them wore purple high tops, one of them wore green high tops. And they were doctors, they wore lab coats and carried purple satin medical bags. And the lab coat and the bag had the logo of the company on it.
Oh, I see.
And they would go to the mall, they would go to the store, and they'd write prescriptions. We created a way that they could analyze people's socks, diagnose what was wrong with people's socks, and write them prescriptions for new socks. Anyway, so I'm telling you that because there's so many different directions that theater can go in. I mean, I never thought I'd get involved in anything like that. I thought I'd be writing theater for children for my whole life. But that was just a really interesting time. And that lasted for me for about 9 years. And then a major corporation in the United States called Sara Lee Corporation bought Socks Galore and More. And that was it. And at that point in time, I went to work for the school system. I taught early on in my career, but I'd never really taught for any length of time. And so this was around 1996, somewhere around there. I went to work for the school system because they were starting an arts school for secondary, but for what we call middle school.
Yes.
Grades 5, 6, 7, and 8, which is what?
Middle school.
Middle school. And I wasn't teaching, I was the program specialist. It was my job to make that school look like an arts magnet school. So I had after-school programs, and I brought in different artists, and we had the symphony come in, and the opera come in, and we had theater groups come in, and my own students would perform, and the music students would perform, and that was fantastic. And I did that for 14 years, and I'm thinking it was about 14 years. Maybe it was 12 years. Okay. So when that was finished, I realized my children have grown up, they've gone to university, they're out in the world. My husband was now living in a different state because his business was in a different state. And somebody had said to me, I know that you can go and teach in other countries as a theater teacher, or any teacher. You can go and teach in other countries. So I thought, well, that sounds interesting. I'm going to look into that. And I did look into it. And one of the first things I found while I was still teaching in Nashville, actually, was there was a job in Azerbaijan. I didn't even know where Azerbaijan was. but they were looking for a teacher for 4 months only, a drama teacher for 4 months only, to fill in their theater teacher's maternity leave. And I went there, and it was an international baccalaureate school, and I really didn't know anything about international baccalaureate theater, but the person whose job I was filling in, she was there, even though she had a baby and everything. I mean, she wasn't at the school, but she'd come in and work with me and explain how everything worked. And so for 4 months I did this. And I think it was beginner's luck or beginner's enthusiasm that I was there for 4 months, and I directed 5 productions. And I didn't even have to direct productions. I just liked to direct productions. Right.
Wow.
Right.
Okay.
I took some of those scripts from the Imaginers Theater Company, and my theater students did the scripts, and we had a kid sitting at the keyboard who, there's no music, you just have to have an ear, who just kind of vamped and did supported the performers with sound effects and music. Like, I don't know if any of you have ever heard of silent movies. But long before people spoke in movies, long before I was born, there was no sound, just visual. Movies were just visual. And so every movie theater would have a person and a piano, not a keyboard. They'd have a whole piano. Yeah. And that person would sit and they'd create all the music for the background of that movie. Yes. Well, that was the idea behind what I did. So let's see, where am I? Okay, so I did Azerbaijan, and I thought, you know what? I think I want to do this forever. And after Azerbaijan, I began applying for jobs outside of the country. And my first job was in the Dominican Republic, where I started a theater program for them, always for high school. I didn't work with elementary. I always worked with high school. Yeah. And then I went from the Dominican Republic. My next job was in Bangladesh, because the woman whose maternity leave I covered in Azerbaijan called and said, would you come and teach with me in Bangladesh? And I said, no. I said, thanks, but no, because it's just too far away. And my husband said, you're doing this for adventure, and that sounds like a great adventure. And and so I did. And you know what? I loved it. I mean, for about 4 months, I cried every time I left the apartment, because Bangladesh people are just subsisting for the most part in Bangladesh, and it made me really sad. But the students were great. And I had a fabulous time in Bangladesh, and the kids I was there for 2 years, and then I went to India, and I taught in India for a year, and then I went to Mozambique, and taught in Mozambique for 3 years. And then I went to Ecuador, and then Kuwait, and my last job was in South Korea last year. Wow. I had a fabulous career. And I always say, if this weren't my life, I'd want it. But something you should know is that with a background in music, like I had a background in theater, if you're interested in international travel and you just want to go and experience other communities, like Mr. Maradona, you can get your teaching certification, get your background in music, get a teaching certification, and then apply to teach in other countries. I mean, it could be that you want to go to Italy for a couple of years. Usually when you go for 2 years. And they really value their teachers at these international schools. And the students you have are very university driven. That's their goal. Because the students are students of expatriates for the most part. There's always a group of local students. But these international schools began so that, and they began in the whole international baccalaureate program began in Wales. And I think that around 1989, they needed to create a program for young people whose parents were working abroad and didn't want to put them in boarding school in England. They wanted to take their kids with them. So they started these international schools all over the world. And that's what I've been doing. And you could too. I mean, if that interested you, you could get your teaching certification, and you could go and teach. If it was music, you could go teach music. If it's math, you could go teach math. You know.
And as an arts teacher living in another country, you do not just experience the country as a traveler, but you get to be a part of the community.
Yeah, that was it.
You get to experience being a part of the people there.
Right. I didn't want to go for a week or two. I just thought it would be much more fun and much more interesting to just go and spend some time in a country. And the countries I was attracted to are not necessarily vacation destinations, with the exception of India. I guess the Dominican Republic could be a vacation destination, but I went to a little village called Sosua on the north coast, and my kids used to go out and go surfing before school in the morning, and then go surfing after school in the morning, and it was you just really get a taste of the culture, you know, and if you love it, you can maybe stay longer than 2 years. And if you think, I've had enough, you can apply somewhere else. It's also a very nice way to save money, because when you go to another country, not a first world country, if you went to Europe to teach, this would not happen. But I went to the Dominican Republic and Bangladesh and India and Kuwait and Ecuador. They give you a house. And so you don't have that expense. So that was kind of,
rent.
You don't have to pay rent. And now if you go to Europe, you do. But these other countries, I think they think it might be a little bit more difficult to convince somebody to go to Bangladesh or to go to India oh, those are the fabulous countries. So anyway, that's pretty much my story.
Thank you, Jennifer. We are a little bit over, but I think I'd like to ask you one question before we stop this talk. So you started this career as an actor. You played Anne Frank, and then you were a scholar, director of fun, and then a teacher, a traveling teacher. Most of our students are musicians and performing artists. Could you tell us a little bit about more careers which have good prospects?
Well, here's my thoughts. The first thing you need to be able to do for any career is be able to explain yourself, whether you're a musician or somebody else, and be able to keep your antenna out there for opportunities. For example, you know, I saw that there was no theater company that traveled in Tennessee, and that there was no theater program at the University of Dar es Salaam. So you start it, but you also think, you know, you could work in public relations. You could, if you can envision it and you can explain it, what you'd like to do with that music. I mean, maybe I know a lot of the actors I work with wrote and recorded jingles for television commercials. Some of them read books on tape. You know, to audiobooks, did audiobooks. Yeah, musicians, I feel like for musicians, for teachers who wanted to be musicians, if you go to another country and you can play solo, or you can play with a band, in addition to teaching, you can put a group, I cannot tell you how many adult bands or mixed bands there were at the schools I went to that were both teachers, parents, kids, sometimes just kids, sometimes just teachers. And they would play for school events, they would play for community events, you know? So, yeah, that's the important thing, is to really kind of get yourself in the mindset to imagine what might be. How could I make something different or better by adding music to it, adding lyrics to it, adding performance to it? Maybe someone's having a party and you make a proposal that you want to go and play for the party, you know? Or you set yourself up as a party performer in addition to a teacher, or a party performer and not be a teacher. You know, you get business cards, you give them out to people, you know, you marketing is the other side of this. If you can think of it, now you got to sell it. So you've got to figure out how can you hustle. You know, if it's a side hustle, fine, and if it's your full hustle, fine. But how are you going to sell it? Yeah. And that's where your imagination comes in. That's where you just really have to network and talk to people. You know, I mean, my whole 9 years with Socks Galore happened because I was in the right place at the right time. It was a total accident. I happened to be a doctoral student for a guy that wanted to start a business. He was leaving education. He was a PhD. He was leaving education. He wanted to start a business. He thought it might be fun to work with me. He wasn't even sure what he wanted me to do. I had to figure it out. You know, the first thing he asked me to do is to create some costume characters that they could send in the mall. And I created some sort of giant goose, mother goose, who had a basket of socks. You know, she went and gave them away. You know, it's just, if you like to think creatively, you know, it's just a great creative puzzle. And I'm going to tell you one other thing. It's all connected. Theater, music, writing. You just have to figure out how it's connected. Because every single thing you do in your background, and if you're playing a trombone, for example, if you're playing a guitar, those are the lenses that you see the world through, you know? And you look and you think, how can I make this situation? How can I change this situation? How can I add to this situation with my music? You know?
Absolutely.
So that's my life. And as I said, if it weren't my life, if this was somebody else's life, I would want it.
Thank you.
Thank
The
you.
lovely Dr. Jennifer Gray, ladies and gentlemen.